This one, as you can tell from the title, is on Casablanca, but it's also Casablanca about Morocco as well. So we're going to sort of back and forth between talking about Morocco and Casablanca. A little bit of a story before we start here. I was thinking the other night of this, and I've been on a few cruises, but I was thinking of my parents. We were from a middle-class family in Canada, and I remember my parents saved for their first cruise that they took on their 25th anniversary in 1975. And I remember my mother had sort of I saw a picture of her in a ball gown, my dad in a suit. And then at the end of it, when he came back, I looked at the picture again, and his buttons were open almost halfway down to his waist. I think the food got to him there. So that was my first impressions of cruises. They haven't changed very much since then. Two images on this, the iconic images, of course. Hassan II Mosque, or King Hassan II Mosque. We're going to talk a little bit about today. Some of you are probably going to be going to it in the short version. And of course, the poster for the 1942-43 movie of Casablanca, Hollywood movie of Casablanca. A little bit about myself before we start here, and I won't go on too long. I am from Canada, born and raised in Canada. Other Canadians in the audience. By the way, how many people here have been to Casablanca? Okay, it's a couple people. So you're going to be the experts here then, okay? Born and raised in Toronto, outskirts of Toronto, but currently live just outside of Ottawa. But for the last 14 years of my working life, my wife and I lived in Prince Edward Island, the island on the east coast of Canada, small island province of about 180,000 people now. And one of my jobs when I was at the university there was to coordinate a pretty unique program, a master's program on island studies. And I also coordinated an interdisciplinary research institute of island studies on PEI. It's a great gig if you can get it. I was able to travel to a lot of different islands of the world as a result of that. I also was fortunate enough to be UNESCO chair in island studies and sustainability, and in the last few years before I retired, I published an introductory textbook to island studies here. Everything you wanted to know about islands but were afraid to ask. So the topics today, we are going to be talking about Casablanca, but we're going to talk about Morocco as well. So we'll start a little bit with Morocco, an overview of Morocco, the economy, population, how it's governed, and we'll have a bunch of slides on Casablanca and end up with a few slides on some of the development challenges of Morocco once again. So Morocco and Casablanca, that blue arrow on the right-hand map there, you can see pointing towards Casablanca. That's not a real arrow in the ocean there, it's just a fake arrow for those who are just wondering. Rabat, the capital, of course, of Morocco, of about 1.6 million people, and Casablanca, the largest city in Morocco, about 3.2 million people. A couple of things you should note about these maps. First of all, look at the one, this clicker, the red, it doesn't show up very well, but look at the left map of the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas Mountains are an important geographical feature. I was trained in geography, not physical geography, but human, economic, social geography, but the Atlas Mountains sort of bisect on that southwest to northeast axis there between the lowlands on the west and the arid Sahara Desert on the right-hand side. And it sort of almost influenced a lot of the culture groups, with the nomadic groups, the Berbers, etc., being part of the east part of Morocco and south, and more sort of the more Arabic and Islamic peoples on the west. They're almost all Islamic on the west. The other thing is, look at these two maps, especially at the southern end of them, and what do you see that's different there? Can anybody tell me what's different on these two maps, the southern end? Yeah, if you look at the southern end, on the one on the left, you can see that it stops right there at Tarfaya. However, the one on the right was probably produced either in the United States or in Morocco or somewhere, because that shows Morocco controlling all of Western Sahara. And we'll talk about that a little bit as one of the sort of challenges in the future for the country is the challenges they're having, the conflicts and tensions in the Western Sahara with the Polisario Front. The United States and Israel are the only two countries that recognize that Morocco, the Western Sahara is part of Morocco. The United Nations defines Western Sahara as a non-governing territory that's administered by Morocco. So a few things about the economy of Morocco. It's defined by the World Bank as a lower middle income country. Now that doesn't sound very good, but when you compare it to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, it actually doesn't do that badly in terms of being a lower middle income country. And in fact, it has one of the highest gross domestic products, GDPs of value of the economy, if you want to call it that, within the Arab world, and especially in sort of in Africa. However, when you start looking at it a little bit more deeply, you realize that it's not maybe as healthy as you might think from those. It's very healthy in terms of the total value of production, but if you look at the economy divided by people, GDP per capita, it actually falls way down, and it's much lower than some of its neighboring countries. I should have said as well, when I looked at that other map, the population of Morocco is about sort of 36.5 million people right now. That compares to Algeria with about 47 million, Libya with just over 7 million, and Tunisia with about 12 million things. So just to give you some perspective of the other countries in the area. Tourism has rebounded a lot in 23, 24, so that's a major element of the economy. The other thing, agricultural production, but the phosphate mining here, phosphates used in fertilizer, agricultural production. Morocco controls 70% of the world's reserves of phosphate. So it's an important, especially with the conflict in Ukraine right now, it's been very important for foreign revenues coming in as well. Some of the sort of economic problems that Morocco faces, I've got a few here. One is high youth unemployment. Its unemployment rate is about 12%. It's been the COVID epidemic to blame for that a bit. But youth unemployment is consistently throughout the 2020s, even up to 2023, 24, has been in between 25 and 30%. And so you can see right there that that's a potential problem for development and potentially even tension and conflict with unrest amongst the young. The second one is, if you see that diagram down in the bottom right-hand corner there, people are often very uncomfortable just using gross domestic product because it just measures the economy. It doesn't measure anything else that's going on there. It doesn't measure the quality of life of people. So the other measure that people often use to compare across countries is something called the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index combines the average income, so per capita income at the bottom. It also includes knowledge, so educational attainment of the population, and it looks at health. And their indicator of health is average lifespan. So combining all three of those together to get perhaps a little bit more of a comprehensive measure of how a country's doing in relation to other countries. And when you look at Morocco, it doesn't do nearly as well there compared against the other countries in North Africa especially, as it does when you look at it in terms of its total economy. I think it's ranked about 120th out of 96 nations in terms of its Human Development Index. And all of the other North African states, they do better according to that sort of Human Development Index measure. So it's improving, but it still doesn't do very well. And then the last one I want to just touch on right here is high level of inequality between the rich and the poor. And an Oxfam report said it's one of the worst. I think it was 40th, where a higher level is bad, 40th of 196 nations. And so it's much poorer in that inequality index than the other nations in North Africa. Sort of just a couple of notes on the governance and government of the Kingdom of Morocco, and I specifically call it the Kingdom of Morocco, is that because it's a constitutional monarchy, sort of parliamentary constitutional monarchy. So the head of state is King Mohammed VI, right now since 1999. The head of state, King Mohammed, is said to be descended from Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad. And you'll say it was his father actually that spearheaded the drive to actually build the Hassan II mosque. And then he took over from his father in 1999. And the current prime minister is on your left there, current prime minister since 2021. So it's a bicameral government, so it has equivalent to a parliament and a senate in it as well. Interestingly enough, you may recall the Arab Spring, and was it 2011, I guess, about there, that swept the pro-democracy movements that swept across North Africa and toppled a bunch of either leaders or dictators in that area of North Africa and sort of East Africa. Well, in Morocco, it actually didn't, there were protests, student protests and others, but it didn't have the same dramatic impact. What happened was that there were some constitutional reforms. The king is still the head of state, and the king can still dissolve parliament. The king can appoint the prime minister from the governing party, and the king can appoint other ministers there as well. But some other nations have those same kind of arrangements. So they devolved some of the powers after the Arab Spring, devolved some of the powers from the king to the parliament and to the government in order to sort of satisfy those people that were in the uprising. And it sort of represented almost a safety valve to allow so that it didn't actually overthrow the monarchy. So a couple of things I want to mention in terms of the culture of Morocco. The first term is the Maghreb, and the second, the next slide you'll see are the Berbers. The Maghreb is both a region and sort of a peoples. You can see in the bottom right-hand side here is that area in green is the area of sort of the Maghreb. The Maghreb is Morocco, Western Sahara, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. When the Islam made its way up into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain and Portugal, in that period from about 700 to about 1000, that was the time when most of the sort of Islamic and Arabs went into that area, and they were stopped around sort of 1000, 1100. That was about the extent of it. And you can still, those of you who have spent any time in Spain and Portugal, see the influence of Islam and the Muslim peoples in there still. And then the Portuguese, especially, sort of started forced their way down, and the Spanish forced their way down between 1000 and 1500 AD, and forced the Muslim forces back down. And they were only stopped by the Ottoman Empire. They came up and sort of buffered Morocco there in about sort of 1500 sort of AD. The French called the people from the North Africa there sort of the Moors, or sometimes called the Muslim Moors. One of the things that's interesting about the sort of the Maghreb is there's still a very strong cultural force, both the Berbers, etc., because they were able to resist almost every one of the conquests. It's a region of enormous sort of invasion and conquest. The Phoenicians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Visigoths, and then finally the Arabs. And finally, the Maghreb and the Berber people sort of acquiesced when the Arabs came in. And there's still a very strong force, as you see in the next slide, but they sort of, they were still able to, they resisted. The French came in, and they were at sort of their height sort of in late 1800 into the 1920s. And so this was sometimes called French Morocco or French North Africa, the French colony here. So the Berbers in Morocco, Maghreb, and in North Africa. You can see here the Berbers are sometimes referred to as the Amazigh as well. It's a semi-nomadic or nomadic group of people. In terms of it's a language group and a culture group. In terms of a language group, it predates Arabic, so it's been around from between 5,000 and 10,000 years now. It, as I say, it sort of acquiesced in Arab rule, but the language of Berber is still very important for cultural and historical reasons. Right now, Arabic is the most important language in Morocco, but the second most important language is French. French is the language of commerce, language of education. Sometimes people refer to that as the lingua franca, and it's spoken by about 2/3 of the population of Morocco. But Berber is still very important, spoken by about 6 million of the 37 million people in Morocco. And it's important for several reasons. One, of course, is, but it's concentrated, you can see on that red area, it's concentrated to the south and east of the Atlas Mountains here. So that nomadic and more Sahara dry sort of area. So it's important because there's 6 million people that speak it, but it's also important because it's that symbol of resistance from wave after wave of conquest that came through there. And so there's still almost an exaggerated importance given its numbers. So let's turn to Casablanca now, or as you can see up here, I've separated to Casablanca. And of course in Spanish, that's Casa meaning house and Blanca meaning white, or White House. Interestingly enough, before that, the Portuguese called it Casablanca. So Casablanca being Portuguese for white. So Casablanca, it's interesting, you see a picture on the left here of Sultan Mohammed bin Abdallah. The Sultan in about the 1500s, there was an earthquake, and he rebuilt the city of what would become Casablanca. But it was called, before that, it was called Anfa, A-N-F-A. And Anfa was sometimes thought, not 100% here, people disagree on it, but Anfa was from a Berber language that meant either hill or promontory overlooking the sea. So Anfa became Casablanca eventually. So that sort of just, and you can also see on the picture on the right-hand side, there is a mosque, the mausoleum of Allah al-Qurani, on the right, and that still exists in Casablanca, a very sort of whitewashed sort of mosque there, overlooking the sea, and that may be what they meant by the White House at the time. So that sort of gives you some idea of why it was called Casablanca here. So Casablanca, we'll start with the movie and then move on from there. Interestingly enough, Casablanca, when the movie came out when it was produced in 1942, the early critics called it, and I'll use the term they used then, Hollywood hokum. So with corny lines, Hollywood hokum. They didn't think it would catch on. Of course, it was selected as the best picture, received an Oscar for best picture in 1943. It was one of the 3 most liked American films in 1986. This is a survey of film instructors in American colleges and universities in 1986. Can anybody tell me what the other 2 most liked American films were up to 1986? Not The Wizard of Oz? Citizen Kane was one. What was the other one? Frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn, right? Yes. So Gone with the Wind. Those were the other 2 of the 3 most common ones. There was a 2002 Network Newsweek poll that said it was the most beloved American movie. And I'm going to have to read this quote because I can't remember it now. The New York Times critic Bosley Crowther quoted as saying, "The picture makes the spine tingle and the heart take a leap." Some of the lesser known facts, one of course, is that it was rushed into production, or into release. It was rushed into release when the Allies actually invaded North Africa. And so it was actually rushed into release. It was canned, in the can, ready to go out. When the Allies invaded North Africa and Morocco, it hit the screens, the big screens, about 2 or 3 weeks later. Second one, I hate to say this for those of you who are going to visit Rick's Cafe, but as most of you probably know, it was filmed entirely in Burbank, almost all in the studio Burbank, and there were some shots of them using the Burbank airport. I just watched the movie again last night, and you look at the special effects of those planes coming in, And it's a little bit different than you see in the special effects now, but it was probably great for that time. Box office earnings of about 10.5 million US dollars, and if you account for inflation, that's about 195 million. So actually it's a blockbuster, but not a great blockbuster when you think of it by the standards of blockbusters today. Iconic lines. You get points if you remember any of the iconic lines, and you get extra points if you say it in an accent that uses Humphrey Bogart accent. So what are some of the iconic lines from it? Sorry?
Play it again, Sam.
Yeah, play it again, Sam. Although I don't know if that was Humphrey Bogart saying that line.
Here's looking at you.
Here's looking at, that was, I didn't hear the Humphrey Bogart accent on that one. Any other lines?
In all the gin jars.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very good, very good. So I wanted to touch on a few things, important things about the history of Casablanca. One of the most important meetings during World War II took place here in January of 1943. You can see in this picture sitting here is Gerard, the leader of the Free French Forces, the President of the United States, Roosevelt, who would be de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, he wasn't president at the time of France, but he was in exile in England, and he would become president of France in 1944, and of course the Prime Minister of England, Churchill. And they met in Casablanca to plot strategy to determine what the next steps in the European war was going to be, the war in Europe was going to be. And one of the things they decided there was the invasion of Sicily. The other thing they decided was something called the Casablanca Declaration. And the Casablanca Declaration, one of the phrases they used in that Casablanca Declaration was demanding unconditional surrender. Does anybody know where that term unconditional surrender, any Americans in the audience? Any unconditional surrender, where do you think that came from?
Civil War.
The Civil War. And who was famous for saying unconditional surrender? Yeah, Ulysses S. Grant, or unconditional surrender Grant, right? So it was Roosevelt in the ending declaration that used that phrase, and used the phrase to imply that they're gonna, well, I'll have the declaration up here. His explanation here is that unconditional surrender means that in our uncompromising policy, we mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution in full upon their guilty barbaric leaders. And it was said that actually Churchill was surprised when Roosevelt said that. He didn't realize that they agreed to that at the time. So I've got a couple here on terms of some of the sites that you might see, not that many, but a couple. This one, the Hassan II Mosque, that was the same picture at the beginning of this slide presentation. As I say, Muhammad VI's father, Hassan II, in 1968, he said, he announced he was going to build this mosque, a wonderful large mosque. And he built it started construction in the mid-1980s, and it ended in 1993, so it was completed in 1993. It's the second largest mosque in Africa, and the minaret that you see on the right-hand side of the left picture there is 210 meters high. It houses inside the mosque 25,000 people, and when you include the area in the plaza around it, another 80,000 people, so 105,000 people. One of the technologies that was used, that was ahead of its time, was a retractable roof they used as well. But set into broader context, what was going on in the 1970s and 1980s, right across the Islamic world, many of the leaders in the countries were building these monuments, a monument to Islam. And when I think of it now, I think of the countries that bid on the Olympics and the buildings that are built as part of the Olympics in some cases are almost nation-building exercises so that they define those countries after the fact. That's what was happening in the 1970s and 80s. Countries and the leaders of those countries would devote enormous amounts of money to building this as a spiritual symbol of Islam within the nations. And the same thing happened here. It cost approximately $600 million US to build, And that would be equivalent to over $1 billion US today to build. The reasons that it was built, there was a line from the Quran that says that God's throne is on the sea, overlooking the sea. And so one of the explanations that Hassan II used was that he wanted to build it in a place that overlooked the sea. Now, why wasn't it built in Rabat, the capital? Right? Interestingly enough, when you start reading the literature, Rabat is, although it's a capital, it was a very sort of conservative kind of place. Not much sort of tension, no uprisings, etc. So building it there politically may not have served that much of a purpose. However, Casablanca at the time had a reputation of being a lot of urban poor, young poor, and so Hassan wanted to, one of the explanations, he wanted to actually provide a project that would actually be a visual reminder to all the people in Casablanca and all of Morocco of the spiritual importance of the monarchy and of Islam, spiritual and visual importance of that, of the monarchy and Islam to the people in that area that perhaps were not quite as gung-ho about the monarchy as he was. The other thing, of course, that it did is, even though there was a high unemployment rate in Casablanca at the time, it provided an enormous level of employment, especially for laborers, in the building of that. And since then, it's provided employment as a generator of tourist revenue. So there's a bit of tension there. It's interesting enough, the funding for this was, it was announced that it would be funded completely by donations from the everyday Moroccan people. And it was originally supposed to be a 40-day period where people could provide donations. Well, that 40-day period, almost like income taxes, that 40-day period went to 5 years. And so they eventually did raise the money from donations, but it took 5-6 years to raise the money for donations. There's a bit of tension about it now because the maintenance costs, a lot of maintenance costs because it overlooks the water, and there's a lot of salt in that water. And so it's actually, interestingly enough, about 10 years after it was completed, so completed in 93, 10 years after it was completed, had to have a major restructure and renovations again because of the damage from salt and everything else there. So I think that Moroccans and the Casablancans are proud of it, and they'll show it off to you as a symbol of their nation and nation building, but there's also grumbling about the cost of the ongoing cost of it. There's also sort of grumbling, as you'll see, about a bit about the monarchy too. So some of you might also be visiting the Habas quarter, or in French, the Quartier Habas. And you'll realize, of course, that the older market, the older Medina market, is the one that is where the locals shop. That's the one that has the winding roads and the winding little alleys and the fruit stalls and so on. When the French sort of took over in the early 1900s, they said that we need a new market. We need something that not only showed a visual reminder of French authority and power, but we also needed a place. This was an expanding city at the time, expanding in trade and commerce. Casablanca was known as the money city, the city of money and trade. So we needed a place actually to house a lot of the migrant workers and the people that are involved in the commerce and trade. And so Laprade was the one who, a couple of French architects, designers, came up with this plan, and as a former planner myself, I appreciate this. They said, well, we want something that has a little bit more ordered space, that is a little bit more, has a French influence, a modern, early 20th century influence, but still, interestingly enough, recognize the importance of the Arab culture and Islamic culture at the time. So it was designed in the 20s, and I think this was sort of thinking ahead of its time. It wasn't just plowing everything down and destroying everything in its path, but it was creating sort of order that was recognized the Arab culture. I have this picture down the bottom right-hand side. That red arrow points to a phrase there, Nouvelle Ville Indigène, or the new indigenous city. So it's said to supposed to be housing 3,000 people, had about 290, 300 houses, about 80 or 90 different shops, a mosque, and you can see the minaret from the mosque in the back there. So it was actually a model that has now been copied elsewhere in Morocco and elsewhere in North Africa. This model that doesn't just destroy all of the Arab influence, it tries to have harmony between the Arab cultural influence and sort of a more ordered space. So I'm going to end the talk with 3 development challenges for Morocco, currently and in the future. The first one is natural disasters, and you'll see in a second why I have quotation marks around natural. The second, as I sort of alluded to earlier in this talk, is youth unemployment, poverty, and especially inequality. And the third one are those tensions over Western Sahara. So I've got a few slides here. This is sort of more of a background slide on so-called natural disasters. This quote up on the top right-hand, NS refers to Nova Scotia and Canada. The Nova Scotia wildfires are not natural disasters. Climate change, forest management, human failure, all the blame. So the quotations around natural, we sometimes believe it's an act of God that happened. Well, often it's an act of human beings and the actions that humans take that either increase the frequency of these disasters or the intensity of the consequences afterwards. So, for example, we know right now anybody that's looked at the hurricane season every year in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, the hurricanes seem to be forming and becoming much more intense and keeping their power longer. And that's largely because of the sea temperatures being higher than they have been in the past. And so that's a man-made or human-made consequence that increase the intensity of those storms. Even the fires in forest fires, had the same impact. If humans actually have created, through climate change, greater droughts, greater heat, and also with monocultures of forests, where you have very dry forest floors, then when a fire does start, it's a much more intense fire than you would have gotten under so-called natural conditions. And the last example I'll give of so-called natural disasters is, see this picture down in the bottom right-hand corner. That isn't the earthquake in Morocco, that's in Turkey in 2023. But you can see some of the collapsed buildings here. Construction standards in some of the developing world are not the same as they are all around the world. And in particular, it's not uncommon for concrete to be used without rebar in it. And if you ask any of the architects, the engineers, they'll say, if you have rebar in it and you have an earthquake that happens, the rebar actually tends to give a bit of elasticity to the building. So they may sway back and forth, but they don't collapse. But if you don't have rebar, it's much more likely that the concrete collapses on it. And so that's why even construction practices by human beings affects the consequences of things like an earthquake, even though an earthquake is not necessarily a natural disaster. I won't get into fracking at all. So we've got a couple of slides here of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions over a period of time. I can't remember whether this is 100 years or not. But you can see, look at Africa, they largely follow the plates, plate tectonics. And look at in between Africa and Iberian Peninsula there. You see the earthquake, the red dots, and active volcanoes. Look at those two, I shouldn't tell you this as well, but look at those two black squares, the black triangles there. Where do you think those squares are? Where in the ocean? Which islands? The Canary Islands. Two active volcano, the Mount Teide is actually, it's been about 100 years since the last one, so if you go into the interior of Tenerife, we probably got a 1 in a million chance. That was the hurricane recently that was a 1 in a million chance. Look at this next map, and this is just a map of the plates in the world, and look once again at the boundary between the Eurasian plate and the African plate here. Just right across through the Gibraltar and just north of Morocco here. So it's not surprising that you get earthquakes like that. So a little bit about the earthquake